Hello friends, my name is Marines. Welcome back to another comment response video. My last few videos have been a little on the long side, so I'm going to try and keep this short and snappy. First, I'd like to highlight something from over on Twitter. So after everything with the reading rush, and I made a video kind of talking about my experience with it and where I was coming from, I also took to Twitter just to talk a little bit about like the patterns we see when these sorts of conversations develop, focusing on the way that this conversation progresses or the different things that people say and do that ultimately derails conversation, whether knowingly or unconsciously. We all get together and say this was not right and we should talk about why this was not right and what we can do better, but then something else is introduced into the conversation and that original conversation like never happens. So I talked about that pattern, but then was also like, let's talk about this. What does it mean to be more inclusive within booktube spaces, within book community spaces, and readathons and things of that nature? So people left so many amazing suggestions and comments, and then we also discussed how people talk about reading diversely and some of the things that we'd like to see change or evolve there. So I'll link both of those Twitter threads down in the description, not only so you can see what I said, but because the responses, the quote tweets were just really, really insightful, and I think important to kind of read through what people are trying to champion and advance within the community. And also, if you organize anything, there are just so many ideas. It's impossible that, you know, one person or one event could cover everything that was mentioned, but lots of ideas there. And I think that one of the big takeaways, especially from the inclusivity talk, is just this idea of options and providing those options up front so that your audience knows that you're thinking about these things. Like I said, just lots and lots of insight that you guys can check out. And of course, let's keep having these conversations and moving this community forward into more inclusive places. The second thing that I wanted to mention in this conversation, and this happened mostly on Twitter, I saw it from multiple people. I remember specifically Christina Marie had a tweet that was in this general vein, but there were multiple coming from the direction of we need to extend grace to people who do mess up and allow them room to improve within this community, and framing it from the point of view of like, when you mess up, what if you mess up? You know, wouldn't you want people to treat you a certain way or extend a certain grace? It struck me because I had this entire portion of that video, of that vlog about the reading rush, in which I talked about this, but because for time I kind of cut it out. I think that we should be able to extend grace to people who apologize and sincerely want to do better. And I think that that is how we get growth within the community. I think the key there is that, one, somebody who is harmed, nobody should expect that they have to accept an apology. They can if they want to, or they can write that person off, cut them out, whatever they need to do for themselves because they are part of the population that was harmed. Two is that I feel like a sincere apology needs to be there, and not only a sincere apology, but an apology with some action steps and some evidence that the person in question, not specifically to the reading rush, but just in general, how we as a community handle these situations where somebody messes up. So I think that we need to see that apology, see some action steps, and we need to see some doing better. And then if that happens, of course, those who can and are willing, and the community kind of as an aggregate, should make space for people to improve their behavior and do better. The third thing, and the thing that I cut out of that video, is that idea of what if I mess up, nobody worries about that more than I do. Like, I can assure you that as somebody with a platform, which I'm always talking about, but somebody who makes content for others to consume, somebody who, you know, frequently is coming up with things off the top of my head to say in videos and podcasts, at events, on panels, nobody is worrying more about messing up than I am. I view this, and you guys know that I do, as taking on a certain amount of responsibility because I am organizing events, because I am representing myself online, because I am promoting things. So I think about that a lot, and I know that if and when I mess up, that it will suck. It will really suck, especially if I'm called out publicly. But I hope that the things that I've been thinking about and internalizing and discussing, and the ways that we have been exploring this as a community about how people mess up, how you apologize, how you move on, like, those are lessons that I'm really taking to heart, that if and when I mess up, that I will be able to apologize with specificity, provide an action plan if that is applicable to the situation, and then do better. And I hope that if I harmed some people, that some of them may be able to forgive me, and I understand if I've harmed some people, some of them will not be able to forgive me. And I hope that as a community, there will be space for me if I decide to do better, if I show the fruits of doing better. On top of that though, I know what it is to mess up because I am human and I've messed up before. And to highlight that point, in the original tweet that I made right after I saw like the live show, the first few minutes of the live show, and I went on Twitter to just kind of talk about like, this is what I saw and this is not okay, I used an ableist term within that original tweet and it took off and it was like liked and retweeted a bunch, and it wasn't until like the next day that somebody was like, hey, this is an ableist term, so maybe we don't use it. And I of course apologized. I deleted the original tweet for that because I in the thread was like, hey, sorry guys, I use this term, here are some better alternatives for this term. And of course that got like 4 or 5 views, so it really didn't match up to the numbers that the original tweet was doing, so I just deleted it. And I also went and I talked to Nicole about it, and I was like, hey, I did this, and we just talked about it and some alternatives and things of that nature. One of my favorite words is graceless, and I use that word in a lot of my reviews. If you go back, if there's something that I feel is kind of clunky, I call it graceless a lot. And I was like, that is one of my favorite terms and I could have used it, and I did it in this situation. In that conversation, Nicole and I made this plan, and I'm sharing it in case it's useful to you, but our action plan is that whenever we are inclined to use or use an ableist term, that we talk to each other like we did, and we talk about alternatives and places we might encounter that term to make it more of a memory point for us. Because now whenever I want to use that term again, I'm going to remember talking to Nicole. I'm going to remember saying that graceless is one of my favorite words in general. And so that creates a place from where I can pull probably easier now than the original ableist term. I know that that was a lot, but it's something that I wanted to acknowledge, apologize for, talk through, especially in conjunction with this idea of like, if and when you mess up, how would you feel kind of thing. I feel like we also have to work on this reframing of how we view messing up. And I recently read So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, and she talks about this work being difficult as well, and the fact that on this path specific to anti-racism, but in general when we're talking about any bigotry within the reading community, as we're all doing this work together, people are going to mess up. People are going to stumble. People are going to get it wrong. People are not going to know any better. There's going to be disconnects, lack of awareness, and things of that nature. I think we need to reframe that from the big boogie monster or the elephant in the room and look it in the eyes and not trivialize it, because at the end of the day, when you mess up, as we're talking about it in this context, you're hurting somebody else. So I never want it to be something so flippant like, yeah, sure, I'm gonna mess up, because you know there is damage there, but also like there's some balance. I don't think it should be so trivialized, but I also don't think it should be something that we're necessarily hanging over somebody's heads. It has to be something that is like an acceptance thing. Like if I want to keep having opinions online, if I want to keep engaging in these conversations, there will be times where I get things wrong. And even though that's not necessarily okay, it is something that I can recover, learn, and grow from. On my last comment response video, I posed a question to you guys about why it's easier to review things that you dislike versus what you like. And a lot of you guys came to very similar conclusions. Lil Lizard Reed says, I think it is a tendency for a lot of us to feel like if we are going to say we don't like something, we have to provide substantial evidence for why we feel that way for that opinion to be considered constructive or valid. I absolutely agree with that. I feel like when I'm putting together a more negative review, I'm coming with a lot more receipts. Like I'm pulling things from the text to show you guys page numbers, examples. Like I want to make sure that I'm backing up my reasons for disliking a thing with something that is a little bit more tangible. And I don't know if that is just like an internalized thing from like, you know, how we view the community in general, or I don't know what we're heading off or why that is the inclination. But yes, I feel like if you're saying you don't like something, the inclination is to like provide the receipts. Lucy says the same thing. I also feel like there's sort of an invisible pressure for me. Like if I say this book was bad, I need to explain why. But if I say this was good, nobody will generally question it. Almost as if having a positive opinion is the default, but having a negative one one is the deviation and therefore must be defended. So her answer to why we feel the need to come with receipts is that the positive review is the default, and the negative you have to be like, okay, I didn't fall in line. Here's why. And then in the first part of that comment, Lucy said something that Connor also said, and he says, I'm one of those people that finds it more difficult to review books that I love than books that I dislike. I think it's because when everything is working for me, I tend to fly through the novel, not taking as much notice of the individual elements that I like. So when I'm done, I'm just like, ah, I love it. Then I have to go back and try to break the book down and actually think about what made me like it so much, etc. When I'm reading something I'm not loving, I pick up on the things I'm really not enjoying and make mental notes, sometimes physical notes about it as I go along. So I have a laundry list of things I don't like before even finishing. For example, gosh, nothing has happened 3/4 of the way through this fantasy book. The character's so flat it could be used as a level. Then my review is practically already written when I finish. Honestly though, I find 3-star books the actual hardest to review. I think it's because I don't have strong feelings about a 3-star book. As soon as he said this, I was like, yes. So going back to the example that I used in how I rate and review my books video, like if this is a road trip, if it's just a smooth ride and you get there and it's amazing, you're gonna just think like that was amazing. But the minute you hit a pothole, you think that was a pothole. And I think that that's true of the experience of reading books that you're enjoying versus books that you're not enjoying. So in middle school and high school, all through middle school and high school, I was in musical theater, and we had this teacher who, I mean, I just absolutely loved him, and I loved everything about my musical theater experience. And he used to always tell us that if somebody comes up to you after a show and says, oh my gosh, you are such a great actor, or something along those lines, that it's like not actually the best compliment that you can receive, because ultimately that person saw you as an actor in a role, when what you want them to experience is to like lose that idea of you being an actor and accept you of just being this character. And I laugh about it now because like we all took this to heart. We were like in character before, in character after, because of the way that he taught us that those lines should like bleed together. I think about this a lot in my reading and reviewing for the fact that I know that a book is there to manipulate my emotions, to manipulate me in certain ways, but I always think about how that is better and more successful when you don't see the strings. So when, you know, the author's presence is not there in a way that makes that distracting. And then there are things that when you come across them, it's almost like tripping. You trip over these things that are bad within a book and you take note of that. And so that's why when you're having a more negative experience, you're noticing these things. You keep tripping, you keep stopping, it keeps pulling you out of the story. The author's presence is there. You see the strings, and all of those things stick out in a way where when it is time to write a review, you're like, here are all the places where I was literally brought out of the experience to think about the mechanics of this work. If you're reading a great book, it's much less likely that you'll pause that way. You're just consuming the thing more smoothly. I think this is why books like, let's say, The Selection or things like that are just really readable and smooth and are so easy to read, particularly because they don't have much plot. That's why I feel like you read that and at the end you're like, that wasn't bad, which was my experience. And then I stopped to think about it in more detail and I was like, it was actually pretty bad, but because I just like one gulp, like, you know, gulp, 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 that story, I didn't trip over anything because there was nothing there. There was nothing to trip over. I just feel like that any reading experience where there's a little bit more friction between you and the work is probably easier to pinpoint those points of friction rather than something that's a little smoother and you just kind of consume and you have to think back about the pieces that made up the whole. Connor also mentions 3-star reviews, and we were just having this conversation kind of unrelated to his comments, but now I'm tying this all together because House Salt just did their live show reviewing Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor, and I really enjoyed that story. I gave it 4 stars, but after we kind of talked about it, I bumped that down to 3.5 stars, but it was still a really entertaining story and I read it pretty smoothly. But as we started talking about it, there were a lot of elements that left something to be desired. I can't remember if I said this on the live show or when we were talking after it, because we always stay on the call and chit chat, and I was just saying about how like in 3-star reviews and on the podcast on Snark Squad Pod, like we might start off saying, I like this thing. Like in general, the sum experience was a positive one, but there were mixed parts that made up the whole, and then when we start talking about it, like most of the conversation is dedicated to the negative parts. And I feel like that's more likely to happen in my 3-star reviews. A lot of times I'm like, yeah, this didn't work, 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 but overall I liked it 3 stars, which is really misleading because obviously there are elements that did work for me, but it's just easier to name and pinpoint the more negative elements. So it's something I want to keep in mind moving forward for 3-star reviews, to try and like see if I'm falling into that trap and clock if I'm doing that. This is gonna be my last comment, even though I highlighted so many more, but I'm just really bad at talking a little bit. Okay, so this is from Tabitha Sierra, and they say, love your channel. Question, how do you feel about DNFing a book you are not enjoying? I don't have any ratings on Goodreads below a 3-star because if I am not enjoying a book, I move on. Currently trying an experiment to keep reading a book I am kind of enjoying and would normally DNF to see what it feels like. There are just too many amazing books to keep reading what I am not feeling. I'm a huge mood reader, so some DNF books I pick up at a different time, and I have enjoyed some of them. Just curious about your thoughts. I feel like that there is a regular Madi answer, like, you know, the sum of my experience as a reader, and like a quarantine Madi answer. So normally I am fine with DNFing books. I am more likely to stick with a book if I am really disliking it because I want to complete the experience and talk to you guys about it, than if I'm feeling kind of middling about it. If I'm not having any feelings either way, that is more likely something that I would put aside. I have a whole video about being like a book optimist, and the whole thing is that like I struggle to say that I've DNF'd a book completely because I am a mood reader, and so many times I've put a book aside and come back to it at another time and been able to finish it on the positive and the negative side. So things that I finished that ended up being like favorites, like The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. It took me a couple times to be in the right place to read that, but when I did read it, I loved it. Or something like Ninth House, which it took me a couple of times to get past the 50-page mark, and then when I finished it, I was like, I hated this. I should have quit while I was ahead. So because I start things and put things aside very frequently, it's difficult for me to say like I've DNF'd something. I said it was different because during quarantine, I've just been putting things aside even more frequently, and so this idea that I'm going to come back to all of it is kind of not likely. So there are, I know, books in here that I've started that are technically DNFs that I haven't processed that way yet, but I'm giving myself even more leeway to start a book, and if it's not capturing me right away, I'm just getting rid of it because I was in a reading slump for so long, because like my last 2 brain cells in quarantine are very specific about what works for them at any given time. So I'm just trying to listen to myself and what I want more and not push anything, because I'm a little bit worried about falling back into a reading slump or like overstressing myself or anything like that. So I have started and put aside so many books recently, and it is why my last like reading wrap up was all 3.5-star books and above, because I'm just like only sticking with things that are right from the beginning, like doing something that I'm enjoying rather than trying to push past anything. In theory, I'm like, yeah, DNF, but in practice, I'm like, maybe not now, maybe later. So that's it for me today. I do really appreciate your thoughtful comments. As always, let's continue the conversation down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. My posture, I feel like, was terrible in this entire video, so that's good. And he was very serious about, you know, putting this on, and we were kind of a big deal in what we were doing. You know, it was like a cross school, whatever. I'm not going to bore you with details of my musical theater days.